Right, so global hotspots, right. Ukraine, the Middle East, but what about East Africa? I mean, things are really heating up between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And like this could be a conflict that makes everything else look small.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's been simmering for a while, but all the signs point to things reaching a boiling point,
Yeah. We're talking about Ethiopia on track to hit 150 million people by 2030. That's bigger than Russia. And in charge, you've got Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, a guy with some serious ambition. And then on the other side, you have Eritrea led by Isaias Afwerki, and they have quite a reputation. Some even call Eritrea the North Korea of Africa. No elections, tightly controlled, press mandatory military service that can go on for decades. It's a stark contrast to Ethiopia, which is often seen as a rising power in the region. But to really grasp this potential conflict, we've got to go back a bit.
Yeah, for sure. Context is key here. This isn't some personal feud between leaders. The roots of this tension go back to Eritrea's fight for independence from Ethiopia, which they finally won in 1993. But that victory came at a price for Ethiopia. They lost their entire coastline. They became landlocked.
And that's a big deal for a country with a rapidly growing population and economy. I mean, imagine 95% of Ethiopia's trade has to go through the port of Djibouti, their neighbor.
Exactly. That means huge fees delays, and essentially their economic lifeline is controlled by another country. And then you add in Abiy Ahmed. He's made some pretty strong statements, even calling Ethiopia a geographic prison. You know, that kind of language reveals a deep frustration.
Yeah, that does sound pretty intense. But Abiy came to power promising peace and unity. He even won a Nobel Peace Prize. It seems a little contradictory to be using this geographic prison talk. What's going on there?
That's the thing about Obi. His actions and words sometimes seem to clash. He's tried to negotiate port access, but those attempts have failed. And he's also been pushing this huge infrastructure project, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GER. It cost a whopping $5 billion and was just finished last year in 2024.
Okay, that's a serious power move.
Yeah.
So is the GER a sign of progress, or is there something more to it?
Oh, the GER is a symbol of Ethiopia's growing economic and technological capabilities, no doubt, but some analysts think it's also a strategic tool. Could Abiy be using it as leverage to pressure Eritrea, maybe even holding water resources over downstream countries? It's a complex situation with high stakes.
Okay, so we have a landlocked Ethiopia feeling choked off a prime minister with a history of bold moves and a heavily sanctioned, isolated Eritrea. This is not sounding good, but what about Eritrea? They're tiny compared to Ethiopia. They're really a threat.
Well, Eritrea's size can be deceiving. They have a long history of conflict, and their people are known for being incredibly resilient, what you might call battle-hardened. I mean, think about it. They fought a 30-year war for independence against Ethiopia in some of the most brutal terrain, mountains, deserts. It breeds a certain toughness.
So no David versus Goliath here, more like two Goliaths with a score to settle.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. And then there's the wild card of Assab. It's a port city in Eritrea, strategically crucial for Ethiopia, especially since the UAE pumped money into modernizing it a few years back. New pier, airstrip, the works.
So now it's a real prize.
Yeah.
Even more so with all the global turmoil.
Exactly. And you can't ignore the global context with the world's attention focused elsewhere. There are whispers that Russia, looking for allies and footholds, might be eyeing Assad themselves.
Wow. So this local rivalry could get tangled up with some of the biggest players in the world. It's a real pressure cooker. And speaking of pressure, haven't there been reports of military activity near the border?
There has been a noticeable uptick in activity. Satellite images show Ethiopian troops massing near the border. Two hotspots are Zalambesa, very close to Eritrea's capital Asmara, and further south near Assab, that key port city.
So is Abiy just posturing? Or is he about to make a move? Is he worried about Russia gaining influence in Assab? After all, he did launch the Tigray War while the U.S. was distracted with its own election.
It's certainly possible he might be calculating that the international community is too preoccupied to step in effectively, and Eritrea's isolation, that North Korea of Africa status, might make them less vulnerable to sanctions, which adds another layer of complexity.
Okay, so we've got Abiy, who has shown he's willing to use force. We've got Eritrea, a tough and unpredictable adversary, and the possibility of Russia entering the picture. This is a mess. Where do we even go from here?
Well, I think the next step is to look at what could actually happen. What are the potential outcomes of this standoff, and what would those outcomes mean, not just for Ethiopia and Eritrea, but for the whole region? That's what we need to unpack next.
Okay, so let's dive into those possible outcomes. We've got a few scenarios that stand out based on the intel.
Okay, walk me through it. What are we looking at?
One possibility, and this might be the most tempting for Abiy, is a quick targeted strike to take Assab and get a naval presence going.
So a surgical strike, get in, grab the prize, get out. Wouldn't that risk escalating things further, though?
Oh, it definitely carries risks. But remember, Assab is kind of isolated geographically. It's about 300 miles from Eritrea's capital, Asmara, but really close to the Ethiopian border, like 5 miles at its nearest point.
So geographically, it kind of makes sense. And doesn't Ethiopia have a much larger military than Eritrea anyway?
They do. The Ethiopian National Defense Force has about 162,000 active personnel compared to Eritrea's 200,000, but a lot of those are conscripts, not professional soldiers, and Ethiopia probably has the element of surprise. Okay, so they have the numbers, possibly surprise, and a good setup for a quick strike, but holding us out would be a whole other thing, right?
You're right. Holding it would be totally different. Eritrea might be smaller, but their soldiers are battle-hardened, like we've been talking about. They've been in almost constant conflict since independence. And don't forget about the terrain, mountains, deserts. It's a brutal place to fight in.
So even if Ethiopia captures Assab, keeping it could be a logistical nightmare. What other scenarios are on the table?
Another possibility, though less likely, is a full-scale invasion to take back all of Eritrea.
Whoa, that seems extreme. What would be the reason for such a drastic move?
Well, remember, Ethiopia controlled Eritrea's coastline for a long time, from 1952 to 1993. There's a historical claim there, and some Ethiopian nationalists see Eritrea's independence as a mistake that needs fixing.
Well, so basically a land grab fueled by old grudges. But wouldn't that be incredibly risky, even with Ethiopia's larger army?
Oh, absolutely. A full-scale invasion would be a huge gamble, lives lost, resources drained, and on the international stage it would be seen as super aggressive.
And wouldn't it risk pulling other countries in the region into the conflict? It feels like that could get out of hand really fast.
It totally could. And then there's that wild card Russia. If they really do have their sights set on Assab, they might not like Ethiopia trying to push in.
Right. That adds a whole other level of complication.
Yeah.
So we've got the quick strike, the full-blown invasion. Is there anything in between?
The third scenario is a stalemate. Basically a long, drawn-out conflict where no one really wins. Think trench warfare, constant shelling, just wearing each other down.
So the worst-case scenario for everyone.
It would be a humanitarian disaster. Hundreds of thousands of deaths, billions of dollars in damage, a massive refugee crisis in a region already dealing with poverty, drought, and internal conflicts.
Sounds like no matter how you look at it, the outcomes are pretty grim. Okay, but let's say hypothetically LD does go for war. What are his chances of pulling it off?
Well, like we've said, Ethiopia has the edge in manpower and probably a more modern military, thanks in part to that GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam.
Right, that massive dam we talked about. I'm curious, does building something like the GAD actually translate into military power on the ground?
It definitely makes them look strong and technologically advanced. It shows they can get big things done. And having control over water resources adds a whole layer of power.
So it's not just the dam itself, it's the message it sends. But what about Eritrea? They might not have fancy new dams, but they do have something Ethiopia doesn't combat experience.
That's a great point. Eritrea has been fighting for its existence since independence in 1993. They've got those battle-hardened soldiers who know the land like the back of their hand.
And their leader, Isaias Afwerki, a dictator in power for over 30 years. I imagine that kind of leadership, while pretty repressive, can create a different kind of fighting force.
Yeah, Afwerki has built a system where military preparedness and loyalty come first. His soldiers are known for discipline and just not giving up.
So Ethiopia might have the bigger guns, but Eritrea has the experience at the train. And maybe even a stronger reason to fight this is starting to feel like a recipe for a bloody and chaotic conflict.
It's a recipe for disaster, no doubt about it. And that's why it's so important to look at what the international community can do to try and stop this. What levers can they pull?
Sanctions are usually the go-to, but you mentioned earlier, Eritrea is already heavily sanctioned.
They've been called North Korea of Africa for a reason. They've learned to survive under isolation. Sanctions haven't changed their behavior.
I see your point. So sanctions on Eritrea are probably a dead end. What about Ethiopia? Could sanctions hurt them enough to deter Abiy?
Maybe, but remember, Abiy has shown he's willing to ignore international pressure, just like with the Tigray War. Plus, he might be betting that the world is too busy with other crises to really do anything.
So sanctions might not be enough. What about diplomacy? Is there any chance for a peaceful solution?
There have been attempts at talks in the past. Abiy even offered to share ownership of the GERD in exchange for port access.
That seems like a big offer. Did it go anywhere?
Both Eritrea and Djibouti said, no, Djibouti doesn't want to lose the money they get from being Ethiopia's main trade route, and Eritrea just doesn't trust Abiy. They see him as the aggressor, and they're not willing to negotiate.
So we're stuck in a dangerous standoff. Ethiopia needs access to the sea, but they're surrounded by enemies who won't budge.
Exactly. And the longer this goes on, the more likely it is that violence will break out.
This is all incredibly complex and concerning, but honestly, with everything else happening in the world, why should our listeners care about this specific conflict?
That's a fair question. This might seem far away, but it could destabilize a whole region that's already incredibly volatile.
We're talking about the Horn of Africa, right?
Yeah.
I know they've been dealing with a lot of issues. Drought, famine, political instability.
Exactly. A war between Ethiopia and Eritrea would make all those problems worse, creating a ripple effect throughout the region. It could displace millions, disrupt trade routes, and give extremist groups a chance to grow.
And of course, the human cost. The potential for death and suffering is huge. I can see why this is something we need to pay attention to.
It's a situation with global implications, and it shows how interconnected our world is. What happens in the Horn of Africa doesn't stay in the Horn of Africa.
So are we just bystanders in all this? Is there anything we as individuals can do?
The first step is to stay informed. The more we talk about this potential conflict, the more pressure it puts on leaders to find peaceful solutions.
Right. Awareness is crucial. But what about something more concrete?
Supporting organizations working in the Horn of Africa is a great way to have a real impact. There are groups providing aid, advocating for human rights, trying to build connections between communities.
So even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely. Every little bit helps, especially in a situation as tense as this.
We've covered a lot of ground. The history, the players, the possible outcomes, even what we can do to help.
Yeah, we've explored a lot, but there's one more thing we need to look at.
Oh, I'm all ears. What else is there?
We have to talk about the United States as a global superpower. They have a unique ability to influence what happens in the region.
The United States, but they're already so tied up in Ukraine and the Middle East. Do they really have the bandwidth to jump into another conflict?
That's the question, isn't it? The U.S. is definitely spread thin both militarily and financially. But the Horn of Africa is a strategically important region, and for a few different reasons.
I know there are those super important shipping lanes that go through the Red Sea. Is that what you're thinking of?
That's a big part of it. The Red Sea is a major artery for global trade, and any disruption there could have a domino effect on the world economy. Plus, there's the issue of terrorism groups like al-Shabaab in Somalia are a real threat, not just to the region, but potentially to Western interests, too.
So from the U.S. perspective, preventing a war that could further destabilize the Horn of Africa and maybe even empower terrorist groups is definitely in their best interest.
Exactly. A stable and secure Horn of Africa is good for the U.S., but like you said, they're already deep in multiple conflicts.
And wouldn't getting involved in another conflict, especially one between two African nations, raise those concerns about neocolonialism? Didn't the U.S. try to stay out of African conflicts after that whole Somalia thing in the 90s?
It's a valid point. Any intervention would have to be carefully considered and done in a way that respects both Ethiopia and Eritrea's sovereignty.
Sounds like walking a tightrope. So what's the most likely scenario? Does the U.S. try to be the peacemaker?
Hard to say for sure. They might try to use their relationship with Ethiopia, a key ally in the region, to encourage them to hold back.
But wouldn't that risk alienating Eritrea? Wouldn't that push them closer to, say, Russia?
There's always that risk. It's like a giant game of chess, a lot of moving parts.
It really shows how interconnected the world is and how things that happen in one place can have effects thousands of miles away. So what are we left with? What should our listeners take away from this?
I think the main takeaway is that this situation is really volatile and could escalate very quickly. We have to keep our eyes on the Horn of Africa.
And remember, while this conflict might feel far away, it has the potential to affect us all. It reminds us that peace and stability are delicate, and they need constant attention and effort.
It shows how important it is to stay informed and involved, not just with the big conflicts everyone is talking about, but also with these smaller tensions that could easily explode.
Well said. And with that, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. But as always, the conversation continues. We encourage you to do your own research, talk to your friends and family about what you've learned, and share your thoughts online.
Remember, knowledge is power. And the more we understand about the complexities of our world, the better equipped we are to make a positive impact.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.